And we are shooting. It is day 5 of the quarantine. God damn it. But aside from all that, let's proceed with the video. I think all of us could remember how old we were and where we were at on that fateful day, September 11th, 2001. It is still considered by a lot of people, me included, as one of the worst terrorist attacks ever implemented on US soil by a foreign enemy. But before there was 9/11, there was 4/19. And it didn't happen in New York City. It happened in Oklahoma City.
We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be.
Hey everybody, this is Atticus the Death Mailer, and welcome to another episode of the Death Metal Historian. And here on this episode, we are going to be talking about the Oklahoma City bombing. Now, this was a subject that I knew of back in the day when I was growing up, but as of recently, around in 2017, 2018, I began to dig deeper and look further into what the motives were onto the Oklahoma City bombing. And also, I watched a Netflix documentary called Oklahoma City, and I just have to let you guys know, it is like the most blue-pilled documentary I have ever watched. And so, like, everything from like the History Channel right now to that documentary, everything is just completely blue-pilled with what I'm going to bring out. But also, I'm going to bring out my dish onto how I feel about the whole Oklahoma City thing. So just bear with me. This is going to be a pretty touchy subject. I understand that, but you know, this is what this series is all about. Talking about crazy, controversial moments of history onto the series that I have brought out. So without further ado, let us begin. It is a bright sunny day in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma on April 19th, 1995. Business as usual for the people clocking in at their shifts as well as driving around downtown. But then, at 9:02 a.m., it happened. A loud, thunderous explosion rang around downtown. People looked over to their complete horror to see the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building with 1/3 of the structure blown clean off. The blast destroyed or damaged 324 other buildings within a 16-block radius, shattered glass in 258 nearby buildings, and destroyed or burned 86 cars, killing at least 168 people and injuring more than 680 others. 6 of those who were killed, unfortunately, were children at a daycare center in the building. And the explosion caused an estimated $652 million worth of damage. Now, the biggest question to everyone's minds was, why? Why did this happen? Who was in their right state of mind would blow up a building in the middle of America, especially a building that had a daycare center? Many people thought of Arab terrorists. Since there was a previous bombing at the World Trade Center earlier, many people thought it was even Saddam Hussein, as well as a drug cartel carrying out an explosion to get after DEA agents. But then, 90 minutes after the explosion, everyone's questions would be answered when the culprit of the bombing was arrested. He was not an Arab terrorist, nor a cartel member, but an all-American, 27-year-old white male. And his name was Tim McVeigh, Gulf War veteran, registered Republican, a Second Amendment rights advocate, and now a right-wing terrorist. Why did Tim commit the worst terrorist act in American soil prior to 9/11? As always, we must go back to the very beginning, to his early childhood. Timothy James McVeigh was born on April 23rd, 1968 in Lockport, New York, and the only son of 3 children to Irish Americans. But he mostly spent a good chunk of his life in Pendleton, New York. His father, William, would work endless shifts to support the family, while his mother, Mildred, would split her time going to work on the road as well as seeing other men. His parents finally had a divorce in 1978, and his mother, along with his 2 sisters, moved down to Florida, where he was left with his father. Tim's life was pretty lonely and neglectful, even when his mother was still around. But that's what you would expect when your parents work non-stop so that you have a roof over your head. While growing up in school, he claimed to have been a target by bullies, where they called him Noodle McVeigh. Bullies would become his very lifelong hatred. Most who know McVeigh remember him as being very shy and withdrawn, while a few described him as an outgoing and playful child who withdrew as an adolescent. McVeigh is said to have only 1 girlfriend during his adolescence. He later stated to journalists that he did not have any idea how to impress girls. While at school, he sought refuge in reading books, and one book in particular became his favorite one. And I think you guys know where I'm going with this one. The Turner Diaries. The Turner Diaries was a book written by a prominent white supremacist at the time, William Pierce. It describes a white revolution in America where it fought against the federal government ran by satanic Jews that allowed black people to do whatever the fuck they wanted. But there was a quote, a very particular quote of that book, that would become a little bit of foreshadowing. We will then drive into the FBI's building's fright receiving area, set the fuse, and leave the truck. I think you all know by now how that inspired him to do the bombing. Tim McVeigh may have been alone and few friends, but he developed a very special bond with his grandfather. Since his father was not around him throughout his life, Tim spent most of his time with his grandfather. And this was how Tim would also develop another lifelong obsession besides his hatred of bullies and the Turner Diaries: guns. His grandfather was really into guns and taught the importance and maintenance and use of guns. They would go hunting together, shoot targets, and read Soldier of Fortune magazines. Now, this is just a little thing I really want to talk about here, because I know a lot of my foreign follower subscribers are always saying like, ooh, why don't you do this thing, guns and guns? And it's just like, you have to really understand here is that in this country we have a very strong culture onto guns. I know the very importance of guns, and I understand that we have a lot of mass shootings in this country, but I did make a video a while back talking about on what I agree with onto gun control and the stuff that it comes to gun rights. But the thing is that it's just a pipe dream of getting rid of all fucking guns in this country, since we have a fucking shit ton of guns across this country and stuff. But yeah, I do believe that this country we have a very strong gun culture. Most of you guys will disagree with me, but you know, that's just it. And if you still want to disagree, well, to quote from the great movie The Big Lebowski,
yeah, well, you know, that's just like your opinion, man.
He briefly attended Bryant and Stratton College before dropping out. After dropping out of college, McVeigh worked as an armored car guard and was noted by coworkers to be obsessed with guns. One coworker recalled an instance where McVeigh came to work looking like Pancho Villa wearing bandoliers. In May 1988, at the age of 20, McVeigh decided to do his patriotic duty and enlist in the US Army, where he began training at Fort Benning, Georgia. Kinda like my dad. During his training, he looked like a kid in a candy store due to his absolute love of guns. He was a model soldier, as well as the first time in many years actually making friends in the military. But it was where Tim would also meet fellow soldier and future partner in crime, Terry Nichols. Like McVeigh, Nichols had an absent father, Second Amendment advocate, and had a distrust of the federal government. He was a top scoring gunner with a 25mm cannon of the Bradley fighting vehicles used by his 1st Infantry Division, and was eventually promoted to sergeant. He was stationed at Fort Riley, Kansas before being deployed on Operation Desert Storm. Speaking of his experience in Kuwait in an interview before his execution, he stated he decapitated an Iraqi soldier with cannon fire on his first day in the war and celebrated. He was one of the very very first shots in the Gulf War. He said he was later shocked to be ordered to execute surrendering prisoners and to see carnage on the road leaving Kuwait City after US troops routed the Iraqi army. McVeigh received several service awards, including the Bronze Star Medal, National Defense Service Medal, Southwest Asia Service Medal, Army Service Ribbon, and the Kuwaiti Liberation Medal. McVeigh aspired to join the United States Army Special Forces after returning from the Gulf War. He entered a selection program but was washed out on his day of the 21st Day Assessment and Section course for the Special Forces. McVeigh decided to leave the Army and was honorably discharged in 1991. I mean, Roy Benavides had his legs blown off and worked vigorously to basically walk again and then became a Green Beret. So, get good, McVeigh. Get fucking good. After his discharge, McVeigh returned to Pendleton, but life was pretty difficult to find work, as it always is with veterans in this country. Oh my god, don't get me started. McVeigh wrote letters to local newspapers complaining about taxes. Taxes are a joke. Regardless of what political candidate promises, they will increase. More taxes are always the answer to government mismanagement. They mess up, we suffer. Taxes are reaching cataclysmic levels with no slowdown in sight. Is a civil war imminent? Do we have to shed blood to reform the current system? I hope it doesn't come to that, but it might. In which I definitely agree. Taxation is theft. He sought romance, but his advances were rejected by a coworker, and he felt nervous around women. He believed that he brought too much pain to his loved ones, and he grew angry and frustrated at his difficulties in finding a girlfriend, and he took obsessive gambling. Unable to pay back gambling debts, he took a cash advance and then defaulted on his repayments. He then began looking for a state without heavy government regulation or high taxes. He became enraged when the government told him that he had been overpaid $1,058 while in the army and he had to pay back the money. He wrote an angry letter to the government inviting them to go ahead. Take everything I own. Take my dignity. Feel good as you grow fat and rich at my expenses, sucking my tax dollars and property. Again. Taxation is theft. McVeigh, of course, with nowhere to go, turned back to his love for guns. McVeigh found a home in the gun show culture, though he remained skeptical on some of the most extreme ideas being bandied around. He liked talking to people there about the United Nations, the federal government, and possible threats to American liberty. This was also where he would get back in contact with his friend Terry Nichols, whom left the Army on a dishonorable discharge. There they would go into business selling Army surplus, and they spent more time together. Their hatred and distrust for the American government grew and grew. But two major events would be the very breaking point where these two former soldiers would cause an apocalyptic cataclysm on their own nation's soil. At the same time McVeigh was fighting off the brutal regime of Saddam Hussein, Randy Weaver was missing his Idaho court date. Weaver was a former Green Beret who took his wife Vicky and their children, retreating to a tiny survivalist cabin overlooking Ruby Creek. This was also an area which was close to an outpost ran by a white supremacist group known as the Aryan Nations. In July 1985, the FBI and Secret Service began an investigation of allegations that Randy Weaver had made threats against the president and the other government and law enforcement officials. On February 12th, Randy and Vicky Weaver were interviewed by two FBI agents, two Secret Service agents, and the Boundary County Sheriff and his chief investigator. Weaver denied the allegations that he was with the Aryan Nations and that he had held a huge weapons cache in his cabin. In October 1989, the ATF claimed that Weaver sold the informant two sawed-off shotguns with the overall length of the guns shorter than the legal limit set by federal law. In November 1989, Weaver accused the ATF informant of being a spy for the police. Weaver later wrote that he had been warned by Rico V, the informant's handler, Herb Byerly, ordered him to have no further contact with Weaver. Eventually, the FBI informant Rico Valentino outed the ATF informant to Aryan Nation security. In February 1991, Weaver failed to show up to court and an arrest warrant was filed. And on August 21st, 1992, U.S. Marshals tracked Weaver into his cabin. As they moved forward, they heard the family dog barking and Randy's son Sammy came out running with a gun. He was packing heat. What happened next to this day, no one really knows. But we do know that a gunfight ensued. While the shots died down, Sammy, the dog, and Depth Marshal Bill Deegan were the first casualties that would be known as the Ruby Ridge Siege. The FBI was soon to be involved. It would last for 11 days and would later result in the death of Vicki Weaver. The deaths of Sammy and Vicki Weaver then brought out a spark to gun advocates as well as white nationalists, even the Aryan nations, expressing their distrust in their minds that this was proof that the US government was truly out to take your guns and would even kill your family to take them.
Baby killer! You're a baby killer! You're a traitor! You're wasting your country!
But unfortunately, this was not the worst thing that the federal government would be involved in. Here we turn over to, and you're probably going to know what I'm going to be saying. On February 28th, 1993, ATF agents raided a compound ran by a cult known as the Branch Davidians, led by their charismatic young leader, David Koresh.
He will bring forth his judgment to light every morning, but the unjust know no shame.
The reasons for the raid was that Koresh was accused of violating firearms regulations, stockpiling illegal weapons, including frag grenades. The raid then turned into a massive gunfight that killed 4 ATF agents and 6 Davidians. The gunfight then turned to a standoff and then a siege. And just like Ruby Ridge, the FBI got involved. For 51 days the world watched. There was a lookout clear away from the siege where curious bystanders as well as fanatical right-wingers would watch the spectacle.
You're next! You're next! Wake up and understand! You're next!
One of those people was Tim McVeigh. At the scene, he distributed pro-gun rights literature and bumper stickers bearing slogans such as, "When guns are outlawed, I will become an outlaw." He told a student reporter, "The government is afraid of guns people have because they have to have control of the people at all times. Once you take away the guns, you can do anything to the people. You give them an inch and they take a mile. I believe we are slowly turning into a socialist government. The government is continually growing bigger and more powerful, and the people need to prepare to defend themselves against government control." The fiasco continued up until April 19th, 1993. The FBI decided that enough was enough and decided to burst through the compound with tanks. And what happened next shocks the world. The compound simply burst into flames, killing 76 people, including David Koresh. Now, there is still controversy about the whole aftermath of the Waco siege because you have people saying that those who were part of the government breaking into the compound say that they brought in tear gas and that the Branch Davidians purposely lit the compound on fire in hopes of achieving martyrdom. While a lot of right-wingers, and part of me does believe this, that the government purposely put the compound on fire. And a lot of people are still arguing about this every single day. And before any of you guys come over to me saying like, "Oh, David Koresh was tickling cats!" Yes, I'm very fully aware that David Koresh was a pretty sketchy motherfucker himself, but that's for probably a future episode in the near future, so to speak. But yeah, I have no sympathy for David Koresh, but I do have a lot of sympathy for the cult members and the children that died in the fire. And yeah, it's still people are talking about this to this very fucking day. But where was Tim while this was going on? Tim was not present at the lookout as he had earlier, but at Nichols' farmhouse in Michigan. He watched on the TV with tears streaming down his eyes, realizing his worst fear had come true. The worst bully in his mind was the federal government. Those tears turned to flames of hatred. The federal government was completely oblivious that 2 years later, vengeance would rise from the ashes of Waco, and that phoenix was McVeigh himself. A year after Waco, on February 28, 1994, Bill Clinton signs the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, aka the Brady Bill.
We have taken this important part of the life of millions of Americans and turned it into an instrument of maintaining madness.
The mandated federal background checks on firearm purchasers in the United States and imposed a 5-day waiting period on purchases until the NCIC system was implemented in 1998. This act immediately was opposed by You guessed it. The NRA. The NRA argued that the Brady Act was unconstitutional because its provisions requiring local law enforcement officers to conduct background checks was a violation of the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. Based on these grounds, the NRA told the court the whole statute must be avoided. Now, this is like my thing onto guns. I'm going to be talking about guns again over here. Now, personally, like, I have no problem with doing background checks if you are someone with like severe mental illnesses. You don't have any rights to hold a gun. But I do believe that, you know, you have guns for hunting, you have guns to protect yourselves, and you even have guns in case when shit hits the fucking fan, aka this virus thing. So, if you want to go boogaloo for some toilet paper hoarders, go boogaloo by all fucking means. But yeah, like, I do believe that later on I will get a handgun myself in case of self-defense. Now, I have shot shotguns and stuff, but that's all that I have ever had experience with guns. But yeah, this is just how I feel about guns, because, like, again, we have a very strong gun culture in this country, and if you don't like it, well, to quote Big Lebowski again,
Yeah, well, you know, that's just like your opinion, man.
and I do not blame people during that time who were law-abiding gun owners freaking out about this. And they banded together as militias.
But when we have a government that is on the verge of being completely out of control, they allow tyrants to come in with hooded masks on, unidentified, bust down your door. It's happening all over America.
In other
we're
words,
going to all say that's okay. Our neighbor wasn't any good anyway.
in other words, the local or the federal agent, I'll give you a chance.
That's law enforcement right there, okay? They're wearing hoods, they're legal, they're protecting the law.
What's wrong
We're
with
out
that?
here in the open, we identify ourselves, and they're saying we're illegal.
This is the new thing in America, as recently reported on the front page of the New York Times. It's called the militia. No, they say they're not racist. It's not just about guns and possession of guns, but the Second Amendment is involved here, definitely. They're proud of their Second Amendment. It's about provisions. It's about protecting your neighbor. They're neighbors. They feel like they're together, they're going to help. And by God, no constable's going to come from some faraway place and break their door down. They'll shoot them first.
After with what happened in Ruby Ridge and Waco, resulting in this bill passing on in Congress, I mean, you had these militias spring up around the country. Some people say that McVeigh was part of a militia known as the Michigan Militia, but as far as I know, I don't believe so. If I'm wrong, please let me know in the comments. McVeigh, during post-Waco, went on a road atlas, hand-drawn designations of the most likely places for nuclear attacks, and considered buying property in Selman, Arizona, which he determined to be a nuclear-free zone. McVeigh lived with another friend he made in the Army, Michael Fortier, in Kingsman, Arizona. They became pretty close that he served as best man at Fortier's wedding. McVeigh also experimented with cannabis and methamphetamine after first researching their effects on an encyclopedia. He was never as interested in drugs as Fortier was, and one of the reasons they parted ways was McVeigh's boredom with Fortier's drug habits. McVeigh's anti-government rhetoric became more radical. He began to sell ATF hats riddled with bullet holes and a flare gun, which he said could shoot down an ATF helicopter. He produced videos detailing the government's actions at Waco and handed out pamphlets with titles like U.S. Government Initiates Open Warfare Against American People and Waco Shootout Invokes Memories of Warsaw 43. He began changing his answering machine greeting with every couple of weeks to various quotes by Patrick Henry, such as "Give me liberty" or "Give me death." McVeigh disassociated himself from his boyhood friend Steve Hodge by sending him a 23-page farewell letter. He proclaimed his devotion to the United States Declaration of Independence, explaining in detail what each sentence meant to him. McVeigh declared that those who betray or subvert the Constitution are guilty of sedition and or treason are domestic enemies and should and will be punished accordingly. It also stands to reason that anyone who sympathizes with the enemy or gives aid or comfort to said enemy is likewise guilty. I have sworn to uphold and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and I will, because not only did I swear to, but I believe in what it stands for in every bit of my heart, soul, and being. I know in my heart that I am right in my struggle, Steve. I have come to peace with myself, my God, and my cause. Blood will flow in the streets, Steve. Good versus evil. Free men versus socialist wannabe slaves. Parade is not your blood, my friend. He hoped that he would assassinate figures of the federal government, people like Attorney General Janet Reno, who was involved with the Waco siege, as well as Lon Horiochi, the sniper who killed Vicky Weaver at Ruby Ridge. But this was later scrapped. He then turned over to Islamic terror. Inspiration for this was the World Trade Center bombing on February 26, 1993, killing 6 and injuring 1,000. He thought to himself, I can make a bigger boom than these simps. His first step was to have someone be involved, and that person, obviously, was Terry Nichols. His knowledge of bombs and explosives made Nichols the perfect candidate to make this bombing a reality. He coincided with Nichols that he was going to make a bigger boom than those simps, and the target was a federal building, just like the Turner Diaries. Now, in reality, if a friend of yours told you that they were planning to blow up a building, the rational thing to do was to snitch on your friend. But you have to remember, this is Terry Nichols that we're talking about here. This was a guy that was just as radical as Timothy McVeigh. And his reply was, if they want a boogaloo, they got themselves a boogaloo. Okay, that's not what he really said, but that would have been hilarious if it was. McVeigh and Nichols began work on the bomb. The bomb's ingredients was an apocalyptic cocktail of consisting of fertilizer, diesel fuel, and nitromethane, a highly potent racing fuel. They went down to Texas to get a batch, but on their travels they stopped in Oklahoma, noticing the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, noticing that it had a daycare center. In his mind, he believed that since the government killed children in Ruby Ridge and Waco, he felt that the same could be done right back at them. So, the decision was made to commence the bombing at the anniversary of the Waco siege. On April 19th, 1995, McVeigh entered Oklahoma City at 8:50 a.m. At 8:57 a.m., the Regency Towers Apartments lobby security camera recorded the Ryder truck heading towards the Murrah Federal Building. At the same moment, McVeigh lit the 5-minute fuse. 3 minutes later, still a block away, he lit the 2-minute fuse. He then parked the Ryder truck in a drop-off zone situated under the building's daycare center, and then locked the truck. As he headed to his gateway vehicle, he dropped the keys to the truck a few blocks away. And at 9:02 a.m., the Ryder truck, containing over 4,800 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, nitromethane, and diesel fuel detonated. And I think you all know the rest. After his arrest, everyone now knew who McVeigh was, and everyone's reactions was met with total fury. He hoped that he would tell his side of the story, convincing to the American people that his reasons for committing this atrocity was justified, and that they would rise up against the government. But unfortunately for him, a vast majority of the American population hated his fucking guts. McVeigh was indicted on August 10th, 1995. Nichols surrendered to the authorities the day McVeigh was identified. Michael Fortier was also arrested and was turned as a star witness in order to gain a lighter sentence. Of the 3 men, he would be the only one who would ever taste freedom. The trial of McVeigh took 1 month. At the end of the trial, the jury immediately declared him guilty and declared death. McVeigh was unfazed and actually was expecting this to happen, hoping that he would later become a martyr for his actions. Terry Nichols was also sentenced to 161 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. Michael Fortier was sentenced to 12 years in prison and fined $75,000 for failing to warn authorities about the attack. On January 20th, 2006, after serving 10.5 years of the sentence, including time already served, Fortier was released for good behavior and onto a witness protection program and given a new identity. And finally, on June 11th, 2001, Timothy McVeigh was executed by lethal injection. His last meal consisted of 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. Larry Witcher, whose brother died in the attack, described McVeigh as having a totally expressionless blank stare. He had a look of defiance that if he could, he'd do it all over again. McVeigh was 33 years old at the time of his execution. At that moment, in the start of a new century, McVeigh was recognized as the worst domestic terrorist in American history. At that very moment, the biggest fear in America was not a foreign power, but white supremacist terrorists who were fanatical in taking down the government that claimed that was after them. But 4 months after his execution, 9/11 happened. And I think you all know what happened during that day. Gradually, the fear of right-wing terror died out, and then emerged Islamic terror and the 9/11 Islamophobia that came after it. The Oklahoma City bombing is considered still one of the worst terrorist attacks done on American soil prior to 9/11, but it also has an even more sinister and dark legacy. On April 20th, 1999, two students in Columbine High School, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, opened fire at their fellow peers and teachers, killing 15 and injuring 24. They were actually both inspired by McVeigh, and the shooting actually was originally a bombing where they planted bombs at the school. When the bombs failed to detonate, they just decided to go shooting. The bombing also inspired future attacks, like for instance the July 22nd massacre and bombing in Norway conducted by Anders Behring Breivik, the South Carolina church shooting done by Dylan Roof in 2015, and the Pittsburgh shooter Robert Bowers in 2018. The late 2010s also had a huge rise of right-wing extremism, especially with the alt-right and the events that took place in Charlottesville. According to the SPLC, and I know I hate to bring these guys up, there are more than 500 militant white supremacist groups active in the US. Now, this is just a little bit of controversy that I'm going to be bringing up. Now, no way in any way, shape, or form, I do not condone the actions done by Timothy McVeigh. But I do believe that his actions and the bombing were the results of the federal government's most controversial moments done on American soil. Ruby Ridge and Waco. If Waco and Ruby Ridge didn't happen, you would not have the Oklahoma City bombing.
I'll tell you what you get! Call the police! Get what you fucking deserve!
But unfortunately, I mean, you know, the federal government likes to poke around stuff. Yes, I'm very well aware that Randy Reaver was involved with the Aryan Nations. Yes, I'm very well aware that David Koresh was a weird-ass kitty diddler. But really, like, I mean, let's be all frank over here. I mean, most of my viewers who are left, most of my viewers who are right, you all fucking distrust the government. And I don't blame everyone here. I mean, I too believe that the government does a lot of fishy shit. And does a lot of shit in, like, you know, Central South America, you know, manipulating and fucking around governments during there. I mean, the Banana Republics is a future episode I'm working on. Also, not to mention the fucking Middle East, where, you know, they're destabilizing governments for oil. I mean, the federal government does a lot of crazy ass shit. Timothy McVeigh basically was the result of some very controversial moments done by the federal government. Now, I don't condone, I don't agree with everything that Timothy McVeigh did. Like, I think we can all agree that, yeah, we distrust our government. But I don't agree with bombing a federal building. Like, hell no. Many Americans still to this day really, truly believe that the biggest threat to America and its values, it's white supremacist terror, and do not want another Oklahoma City-esque bombing to occur again. So what do you guys think about the topic of the Oklahoma City bombing? Did you like it? Did you dislike it? Were you there during that moment in April 19th, 1995? Leave it down in the comments below. And also just stay tuned for more videos and stuff, and I hope that all of us can really put this whole quarantine thing behind all of us here. Without further ado, ladies and gents, I am Atticus the Death Miller. Hope you like this video, subscribe to my channel, links are down in the description below. Keep it metal and have an excellent and blessed day, y'all.